Right now, at this exact moment, your guardian angel is reaching out to you. Not tomorrow, not someday, right now. And if something inside you feels like this message was meant for you, that's not a coincidence. That's heaven getting your attention. Stay with me, because before this message is over, something inside you is going to shift. Something is going to feel lighter, and you are going to walk away knowing, truly knowing, that the love you've been waiting for is closer than you ever dared to believe. Welcome, beautiful soul. You are divinely protected. You are deeply loved, and you are exactly where you are supposed to be. This is Angel's message for you, and today, your angels have something powerful to share with you. Dear one, not every day feels easy. Sometimes the heart goes quiet, not because it has stopped feeling, but because it's carrying so much. There's a space inside you that even on the good days, even in the middle of achievements and laughter and all the moments you share with the world, there's still something waiting. Something that can't quite be put into words. It's as if a part of your soul already knows. It knows there is someone out there feeling the same longing, searching for the same kind of connection, hoping for the same kind of love. Not the kind made of pretty words or empty promises, but the real kind. The kind built on presence, on care, on the deep peace that only true love can bring. And today, with all the light your angels carry, they have come to tell you something. The waiting is over. This is a confirmation, a divine message delivered to you today, because the time has come to welcome your soulmate and step into a life full of real, lasting happiness with the person who already loves you deeply. If your heart truly longs to be close to the one who is meant for you, then now is the time. Open your heart and keep reading, because what comes next is for you. Dear one, if you've been feeling something shifting inside lately, a kind of lightness you can't explain, a quiet sense of anticipation, a feeling that something good is just around the corner, that is not your imagination. That is heaven preparing you. You are about to step into a love that will bring meaning to your days, a love that will reach the spaces no other experience has ever touched. What is getting ready to happen in your life is not a coincidence. It is an ancient promise that is finally being fulfilled. And this person who is coming toward you, they have also walked a long journey. They have also searched. They have also dreamed. They have also prepared themselves without quite knowing where you were. Both of you have been guided here, because heaven always knows the exact moment when two souls are truly ready to recognize each other, ready to choose each other without fear, without games, without rush. This love that is coming will walk with you in the good times and in the hard times. It will commit. It will show up. It will not crumble at the first obstacle, because it understands that the connection between two souls is something sacred, something worth caring for with full devotion. A new chapter of your life is being written right now. Heaven is placing a gift in your hands, and this gift has a name, a face, and an energy that is already reaching out to yours. Your soulmate, the presence that will add to your life, walk beside you, and finally make everything fall into place. And know this, you will not need to fight to be seen. You will not need to beg for attention. You will not need to doubt your worth. With this person, everything will feel different, because true love does not come to drain you. It comes to add to you. You will feel it in the small things, in sincere moments, in the quiet peace that floods in when your eyes meet and your heart finally recognizes. It has arrived where it always longed to be. Receive this with an open heart. When heaven decides to bring two souls together, nothing can stand in the way. And what is about to show up in your life is one of those stories that can only be explained by the power of love. A love that goes beyond time, beyond distance, beyond every uncertainty this world can throw at it. Dear one, There are moments when the heart seems to call for something that has not arrived yet, but that already exists somewhere. It feels like a living memory inside you, a kind of knowing that does not come from your mind, but from your soul. Even without knowing exactly where this person is, part of you is already waiting with warmth, already reaching out. And this is not neediness. This is not fantasy. This is intuition. This is your inner wisdom recognizing that something special is on its way to you. You have felt it before, that deep desire to share life with someone who understands even your silences, who respects your timing, who sees you fully without needing endless explanations. A love where there is genuine exchange, where actions speak, where real presence is felt. A love that is light yet strong, calm yet deep, real even on the most ordinary days, and most importantly, given and received equally. This is the kind of love that is now moving toward you, because heaven does not overlook. A heart that beats with truth. And if you feel deep inside that you were born to love and to be loved completely, it is because that love is searching for you too. There is a harmony being formed right now. Even if you cannot see all the signs yet, there is a divine force guiding you, step by step, toward the person who was made to walk beside you. It is not always easy to see when destiny is opening doors. Sometimes life brings changes that seem random, encounters that seem like chance, decisions that look simple on the surface but carry a higher purpose beneath them. Nothing is by accident when it comes to true love. What your heart has asked for has been prepared by heaven for a long time, because what belongs to you spiritually, no one can take away. It may take time, it may travel unexpected paths, but it always finds its way back to you. This waiting, even when it felt painful, was also sacred. It shaped you. It taught you to put yourself first. It helped you heal old wounds and grow stronger. Because the love that is arriving is not here to fill a hole inside you. It is here to overflow what already exists in you. Your soulmate is not coming to solve your problems. They are coming to add to your journey, to walk beside you with respect, with admiration, with genuine devotion. And even if doubts linger, even if fears or old scars still come up sometimes, know that everything you have been through up until now was preparation. Not one moment of pain was wasted. Not one disappointment was for nothing. Each experience refined your heart and brought you closer to this new reality that is beginning to open up. Heaven does not waste any part of your journey. It turns everything into roads, into bridges, into opportunities, so that you can finally live what you truly deserve. You have learned to love with maturity. You have come to understand that love is not about demands or control or forced presence. Love is connection. It is mutual surrender. It is knowing there is someone in this world with whom life takes on a deeper meaning, and that someone is already being guided toward you. The presence of your soulmate is drawing closer as the answer to everything your heart has ever asked for with truth. Right now, energies are aligning. Feelings are awakening. Paths are being cleared for this encounter. Maybe you have already crossed paths with this person. Maybe you have not met yet. What matters is that heaven has already given the sign. And when heaven confirms, there is no more room for doubt. You are stepping into a new phase of your life. True love will no longer be just a hope. It will be a living reality, present and transforming. And it all starts here, because when the heart asks with sincerity, the universe listens. When the soul calls out with truth, heaven answers. And now it is your turn to be answered. Dear one, sometimes without you fully noticing, small transformations begin to appear in your life. A shift in your feelings, a change in your thoughts, Even the way you see love starts to look different. It is as if your soul is preparing itself for something new, even before anything new has actually arrived. This is not coincidence. These are signs. Small confirmations that heaven sends to show you that what you have been waiting for is getting closer. Maybe you have suddenly felt the urge to take better care of yourself, to look at yourself with more love, to protect your peace, to value your inner calm. This happens because your energy is aligning with the arrival of your love. Taking care of yourself is not just about how you look. It is a spiritual instinct, a preparation for someone who is also coming with truth, with emotional depth, with the desire to build something real by your side. Another sign is when shallow things begin to lose their appeal. What once filled your time no longer satisfies you. That is because your soul is making room for what truly matters. Connections without depth stop making sense. You start to long for something with more presence, more substance, more heart, and that is exactly what is on its way to you. You may have also noticed a quiet sense of anticipation inside you, even without any clear reason. A feeling that something good is coming, even if you cannot name it. That is more than a feeling. That is your energy field sensing the approach of love. Your soulmate is also being prepared to find you, and that creates an invisible link between you. The stronger that bond grows, the more you feel that quiet excitement inside. Another clear sign is when you suddenly have more clarity about what you truly want and what you do not want in love. You stop idealizing. You start seeing things with more wisdom. You understand that real love does not need to be perfect. It just needs to be genuine. That emotional maturity is one of the greatest signs that you are ready to receive your soulmate. You may also have noticed that you have started to see love everywhere, in small everyday details, in songs that touch you differently, in other people's stories that suddenly inspire you. That is heaven showing you that love is drawing near your reality. Everything around you is being quietly tuned to prepare you for this new chapter. And perhaps the deepest sign of all is a feeling of completeness even before anything has arrived. You no longer feel desperate to search. You feel at peace. This happens because your soul knows love is already on its way. When a true connection is close, desperation gives way to calm. A natural balance settles over you. A feeling that everything is okay, and it is only going to get better. Dear protected one, heaven always speaks to us in gentle ways. And when it comes to love, it speaks first to the heart. So if your heart is sensing something different, if your intuition feels sharper, if you have been dreaming of someone you do not yet know, if you feel an unexplained desire to share your life with someone special, listen. These are signs. And the more you tune into them, the clearer the approach of your love becomes. You do not need to understand everything right now. You just need to feel, to be present, to stay open. Life is giving you signs because your soulmate is closer than you think. And this person, just like you, is already feeling the same energy calling them forward. Dear one, it is not always easy to understand why certain delays happen. There were probably times you wondered why true love had not arrived yet. Times you thought maybe something was wrong with you, or that time was working against your happiness. But what was really happening was a sacred process, a quiet path of inner healing, preparing you to live the love that is now drawing closer and closer. Heaven is never late. It waits for exactly the right moment, and that moment has nothing to do with age or how long you have been waiting. The right time is when your heart is free from what once hurt it, when your soul no longer carries the heavy weight of past loves, when you no longer see yourself through the lens of old wounds, but through the strength you gained by healing from them. And that is exactly where you are now. You went through difficult seasons. You had to rise again after losses, rebuild yourself after disappointments, learn to love yourself when the love of others fell short. And even when you felt like you had nothing left, you kept going. You did not give up on yourself. That matters deeply. Emotional healing does not happen all at once. It is built step by step, through every single choice to keep moving, even in the face of pain. Today, you are no longer looking for love to save you. You are looking for love to walk beside you. That is maturity. That is wisdom. And that is exactly what heaven was waiting for. Because the love that is about to enter your life requires devotion, but it also requires balance. It will bloom with more depth precisely because you allowed yourself to grow before finding it. During this journey, you also learned to honor your own feelings. You stopped being so hard on yourself. You stopped accepting less than you deserve, and you began recognizing your true worth. That is part of healing. Understanding that love does not go hand in hand with suffering. That real care should not come with constant doubt. That being treated with respect and kindness is not a luxury. It is the foundation. When you reached this level of clarity, your energy shifted. And when your energy shifted, you aligned with something far greater. Your soulmate has also gone through transformation. This person also faced inner battles and needed time to grow stronger. And now, both of you are in sync. The old wounds that once could have stood between you no longer have space. You are not the same person you were. And that is a blessing because now you are ready to welcome a love without carrying ghosts, without repeating painful patterns, without hiding behind fear. All of this brought you here, to the truth that love does not need to be a struggle. The love that is arriving comes to add to you, to strengthen what is already good in you, to share in your joy, and when life gets heavy, to support you. But most of all, it comes to embrace you exactly as you are, with your story, with your scars, with all of your light. That is why now is the right time, because you prepared yourself, because you made peace with the parts of yourself that had been forgotten. Because you learned that love is not control, it is freedom. Not possession, it is partnership. And life is responding to that truth in you. The energy around you is lighter now, more open, more ready to receive. Heaven does not deliver true love to a soul still trapped in the past. It delivers it to those who are ready to live the present with full presence. Dear one, know that everything you went through was worthwhile. Every tear you shed cleared a space inside you. Every moment of doubt brought you closer to your truth. And every time you chose to believe, even in the middle of pain, you opened the way for love to find its place in your life. Do not doubt what is coming. What heaven has set aside for you is not just a relationship. It is a partnership of souls. It is connection with purpose. It is the daily presence of someone who will walk with you, not as someone coming to complete what is missing, but as someone coming to celebrate everything you already are. Dear one, there is something that goes beyond logic, something that time cannot erase. It is a kind of memory that is not stored in your conscious mind, but in your deepest feelings. It is that sense that someone is missing, even when you cannot say who. It is as if part of your being has always been searching, not out of need, but out of recognition. And this search is not in vain. There is a bond between you and your soulmate, a connection that crosses distance, that stays alive even when the mind cannot explain it. You may have noticed feelings that seem to come from nowhere, a longing that has no name, a warmth toward someone who has not yet arrived, a desire to care for a person you do not yet know. All of this has a reason. It is the connection that has always existed between you and this someone. a bond that has never been broken. The energy of two souls that will recognize each other even before the first word is spoken. This bond is older than you imagine. And no matter how many different directions life has pulled you until now, the connection between you has remained. Because true love is never lost. It only waits for the right moment to bloom. And that moment is now drawing near with a quiet, steady force you can already feel in your heart. This person feels it too, even if they do not fully understand it yet. Your soulmate carries the same restlessness, the same longing for a presence that truly makes sense. Both of you have been guided along different paths, yet touched by the same absence, the same need for real connection, and that makes the bond between you grow even stronger. Sometimes the universe removes certain distractions so we can clearly see what truly matters. That is why some old connections had to end. It was necessary to release what hurt, what did not flow, what lacked real roots. Heaven prepared this space inside you so that when your soulmate arrives, there will be no confusion, no heavy weight, only presence, devotion, and truth. This invisible bond shows itself in many ways. In dreams that feel more real than waking life. In thoughts that arrive out of nowhere and bring deep peace. In moments that feel strangely familiar even though they have not happened yet. When two souls are connected by something greater, time does not erase it and distance does not weaken it. What brings you together is not only the desire to be close, but the alignment of purpose, the harmony of values, the shared will to build something that goes beyond the surface and reaches what truly matters. And now this bond is becoming even more real, because the time has come to recognize it, to welcome it, and to live it fully. Dear one, your love is not coming to fill empty spaces. They are coming to walk beside you with truth, with maturity, with actions that speak louder than words. This is a love that comes with purpose. A love designed to transform not only your feelings, but your very path. When two souls meet in this kind of energy, everything around them begins to align. Opportunities appear, doors open, connections deepen, because where there is love with purpose, blessings align with that purpose. Your soulmate does not come to take your freedom. They come to expand it. They will understand your silences, respect your space, and offer the kind of companionship that does not weigh you down. It lifts you. It will be a love that brings peace even in the chaos, support when the world feels heavy, and joy in celebrating every one of your victories. Because someone who truly loves you takes joy in watching you bloom, and you will also be that presence for them. You will strengthen, encourage, extend a steady hand in hard times and celebrate together in the good ones. Because love, when it carries purpose, becomes home for each other. Every step taken with this person will be filled with intention, and that will make everything feel lighter, clearer, and safer. You will not need to give up who you are. On the contrary, who you are will be honored. Your soulmate will see your light not as something to compete with, but as something that beautifully completes their own journey. The arrival of this love also marks the arrival of a new version of yourself. A version that loves without fear, trusts without constant worry, lives without armor. Because this person is not coming to bring doubt, they are coming to bring clarity. They will not ask you to change. They will simply invite you to be fully, freely yourself. And this alignment is more than romantic. It is spiritual. You will notice it in the way life around you begins to open up. Possibilities that once felt out of reach will start to feel real. Because where there is true love built on purpose, there is also blessing built around that love. Dear one, perhaps you have already noticed something different is happening both inside and around you. small changes that carry a deep force. It is as if your energy is being reorganized to receive what your heart has asked for with so much faith. True love, when it comes with purpose, begins to work before it even arrives. It heals. It reorganizes. It strengthens. It uplifts. Your thoughts shift. Your priorities adjust. The way you see love starts to transform. You begin to long for what is simple, yet sincere. You value real actions over pretty words, deep conversations over shallow ones, presences that add rather than drain. This is not a coincidence. It is a direct reflection of the energetic connection already forming between you and this person being guided toward you. Your outer life is also beginning to move. People and situations that no longer serve you are quietly falling away. Unexpected openings are appearing. The universe is clearing space for the new, for what truly aligns with who you are. Because true love does not step into a life still crowded with what hurts. It arrives when there is room for it to be fully lived. You may also notice a growing inspiration to take care of yourself, to feed your mind and your spirit with good things, to surround yourself with lighter energy. This is your soul already sensing that something special is near and wanting to prepare in the most natural, beautiful way. Dear protected one, there are loves that do not arrive not because someone is unworthy, but because there are too many walls around the heart. Sometimes without realizing it, we build defenses so high that real love cannot find a way in. These walls form over time, through old wounds, through broken promises, through experiences that left their mark. But now, heaven wants you to see that to truly welcome this love, it is time to release what no longer serves you. One of the most common barriers is the fear of being hurt again. After disappointments, it makes sense to want to protect yourself. But too much protection also pushes love away. The love that is coming is not like anything before. Your soulmate is not carrying the mistakes of anyone in your past. They are coming with a new perspective, a new kind of care, a fresh energy. And your heart needs to be willing to open to that new possibility. Another thing to release is holding on to stories that have already ended. Even when we know something no longer makes sense, the mind replays it, imagines what could have been, compares everything new with what has already passed. This creates an invisible prison, and you were not made to live trapped in what was. Heaven wants you to live in the now, with truth, with presence, with freedom. There is also the voice of self-doubt, that inner whisper that says you are not enough, that no one will love you exactly as you are, that relationships always end in pain. That voice is not truly yours. It was built out of wounds that have not fully healed. And now it is time to quiet that old story and rewrite your truth. You deserve to be loved deeply. You deserve to be chosen without hesitation. You deserve a love that sees you, values you, and stays. The fear of being vulnerable is another thing to gently acknowledge. Opening your heart does take courage, but it is also an act of wisdom. You have learned to listen to yourself, to respect yourself, to notice the signs. Now you can trust your own intuition to guide you towards something truly worth it. Do not close yourself off just to avoid pain. Because when you close yourself to pain, you also close yourself to love. Another pattern to let go of is comparison. Measuring your journey against others, your timing against theirs, your story against someone else's. Every soul has a unique path, and yours is being guided with perfection. Even if you cannot see all the details right now, comparison creates anxiety and a false sense of not being enough. Trust your process. The love that is coming belongs to you, and no one else can live it the way you are about to live it. Dear protected one, For this love to find space in your life, it is time to let go of the weight. Forgive what never was. Release what has already ended. Lower the walls that no longer make sense. You do not need to prove anything to anyone anymore. All heaven wants now is for you to be available. At peace with the past. Connected to the present. With arms open wide to receive what is coming with truth. Your soulmate will not come to save you, but to walk beside you. And for that, you need to be whole within yourself. Not perfect, but whole. Aware of what you deserve. Aware of what you want. Aware that love is not war. It is building day by day with intention. It is in this energy that real union is formed. Not through need. Not through rushing. Through alignment. Dear protected one, there comes a moment when all the heart needs to do is let go. Not out of giving up, but out of trust. Trust that what is truly yours cannot be lost. Trust that what comes with purpose arrives exactly when the soul is ready. And what heaven wants to remind you of right now is this: surrender is more powerful than any attempt to control. Because the love that is approaching does not depend on how much you rush toward it. It depends on how open you are when it arrives. You have already done so much. You have healed. You have grown stronger. You have recognized your own worth. Now the invitation is different. It is no longer about searching or protecting. It is about allowing. Allowing divine timing to work in your favor. Allowing your soulmate to reach you at the right pace, in the right setting, with the right heart. True love cannot be forced. It blossoms, and for it to blossom fully, it is necessary to release anxiety and trust the process. This kind of surrender is not about crossing your arms and waiting passively. It is about opening your heart wide. Living with the awareness that everything is being guided with wisdom. Acting with love every day, even before that love has shown up in physical form. Keeping faith alive, not as anxious waiting, but as a calm, quiet certainty. What comes from heaven is never late. It matures, and when it arrives, it fits perfectly, like the answer you always knew was coming. You may be wondering, how do I surrender when fear is still there? The answer lives in accepting what is already inside you. When you realize you do not need to control everything, when you stop trying to anticipate what has not arrived yet, you create space to receive life lightly. Surrender is the moment the soul stops chasing and starts trusting that what belongs to it is already on the way. The love approaching you needs to find in you not just an open heart, but a calm soul. Calm because it knows everything happens at the right time. Calm because it has learned that no absence is permanent. Calm because it understands that love does not come to fill, it comes to overflow. Dear protected one, it is time to lift the weight from your shoulders. Take a deep breath and say quietly to yourself, I am ready. Ready to love without fear, to trust without rushing, to receive without resistance. Your soulmate is also being guided by this same rhythm. And when your paths cross, it will feel natural, light, and clear. Because what is divinely aligned does not need to be proven. It confirms itself in the peace it brings. This is what total surrender feels like. It is living with faith. It is walking forward with the quiet belief that what awaits you is not small. It is abundant. It is given and received equally. It is full of truth. Do not close yourself off out of fear of disappointment. The love coming is not a repeat of the past. It is renewal. And to live something new, you must surrender in a new way, with more awareness, more presence, more courage. You have come this far because you trusted. So trust just a little more. Trust heaven's timing. Trust what you feel. Trust the love being prepared for you with such care and intention. When you live with faith, the waiting becomes light, and love, when it arrives, feels like the most perfect answer. Dear protected one, now that you have understood the value of your journey, the power of the signs, the gift of healing, and the strength of surrender, it is time to receive a truth that heaven is whispering directly to you. You are going to live a love story that is light, deep, and true, by the side of someone who genuinely loves you. And this happiness you have dreamed of for so long is not an illusion. It is a promise, a spiritual confirmation. Life did not make you wait without reason. Everything had a purpose. The pauses, the detours, the lessons, even the missed chances and the moments of doubt. Every single part of your journey prepared you for this moment. Heaven never wastes a tear, a prayer, or a hope. Every time your heart believed, even when it was hurting, even when it was tired, new energy was being created. And it is that energy, your energy of faith, that is now giving shape to what is about to arrive. A relationship that will be both refuge and home. You will no longer need to settle for half love. You will no longer need to wonder if you are enough. Your soulmate will recognize your essence from the very beginning. They will listen to you, value you, see you fully, and the most beautiful part of all, they will choose to be with you out of true love. Not out of habit, not out of convenience, but out of a sincere, deep, and lasting choice. This someone will arrive with intention, with action, with care, because for them, love is also sacred. The happiness you long for will not be found in grand gestures alone. It will live in the small things of everyday life, in sincere conversations, in shared laughter, in comfortable silences, in the spontaneous moments that show real presence. You will feel that you can breathe freely beside this person, without hiding who you are, without fear of being too much or not enough, because true love welcomes, it respects, cares, stays. Heaven confirms this love is real and it is closer than you think. You can already feel the change in the air, in the way you see the world, in the hope that keeps rising even after the hard seasons. This is not coincidence. This is the final preparation. It is heaven telling you that the time of waiting has given way to the time of fulfillment. And now your life is about to be touched by a love that will light up every part of your existence. Dear protected one, doubt no more. You did not receive these words by chance. There is a divine force guiding everything with precision. Happiness by the side of your soulmate is a reality being built right now, day by day. And every step you took, even when you did not understand why, was leading you toward this destiny. A destiny of mutual love, real partnership, and shared joy. And when this person stands before you, your heart will know. There will be no need to question. There will be peace. There will be truth. There will be love given and received in equal measure. You will see in their eyes a reflection of your own courage, the courage it took to keep believing when everything seemed uncertain. And love will feel so natural, so aligned with who you are, that it will seem as though it had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Heaven has not forgotten you, not ever, and now the time has come to receive. The time has come to live everything you always knew you deserved, because you do deserve it, because you prepared yourself, because you learned, because you are ready. The love that is coming is a blessing, and the happiness it brings will be lasting, not fleeting. You will be deeply loved by the one who is meant for you, and it will not be just any love. It will be the love that honors your soul, walks steadily by your side, and chooses to stay day after day. because this love was written for you, and it is about to become your reality. Dear protected one, now that everything has been shared with you, take just a moment. Close your eyes if you feel called to. Breathe slowly. Notice what is happening inside you right now. Something feels lighter, stronger, more full of faith. That is not just from words. That is the truth your heart has recognized. Because when heaven speaks, the soul understands. And today the message is clear. You are ready. Your soulmate is on the way. Everything that once felt distant is beginning to draw near. Not with confusion, not with chaos, but with serenity and certainty. Because true love does not arrive like a storm. It blossoms, steady and sure, like something that has always known exactly where it belongs. And this someone belongs in your life. They are not coming to fill empty spaces, but to walk beside you with truth, with maturity, with the kind of actions that show the strength of a daily, devoted choice. You have passed through many seasons, and in every single one, heaven was with you, even in your pain, even in the moments you felt most alone. Something was always guiding you, and everything, absolutely everything, was part of a greater plan. Now that plan begins to show itself in beauty, in depth, and in purpose. The waiting is ending. The time of harvest has come. And the seed you planted with faith, even through tears, is about to bloom in the form of love. From this moment forward, your life will be accompanied by a presence that does not take your freedom, but expands it. Your soulmate will understand your silences, respect your space, offer companionship that lifts rather than burdens. It will be a love that brings peace in the chaos, support when the world feels heavy, and genuine joy in celebrating every one of your victories. Because someone who truly loves you finds joy in watching you flourish. And this is what heaven has prepared for you. A love that overflows, that builds, that stays. A love where you are seen, valued, and respected. A love that will inspire you to want to keep growing, not from pressure, but from the beautiful desire to grow together. All of this is coming, not as a distant promise, as a reality drawing closer every single day. Dear protected one, in the coming days, pay attention. Small changes, new encounters, feelings you cannot quite explain, deeper perceptions. These are not chance. These are the final signs that what is spiritual is becoming physical reality. Your only task now is to remain open. Believe what has been shared. Trust what you are feeling. Keep preparing yourself to receive what is yours by divine right. Do not let doubt steal the peace that has begun to grow inside you. When heaven speaks, it speaks to affirm, not to confuse. The love of your life is coming, and it will be a love that is joyful, light, mutual, and lasting. A love that honors your story and walks with you into a future full of meaning, warmth, and true companionship. Keep this in your soul. You are not waiting for a distant dream. You are aligning with a real promise. Your soulmate is being guided to you with the same faith, the same devotion, the same desire to live a true and lasting love. And when that meeting happens, nothing will be the same. Everything will be better, clearer, more beautiful. Keep believing. Keep taking care of yourself. Keep making space for what is new, because what heaven has prepared for you is greater than any expectation you have ever had. And the love that is coming will show you just how worth it was to keep believing until now. Your time to love and to be loved deeply has arrived. Live each day with that certainty in your heart, because now, finally, heaven confirms it. You will be happy, truly deeply happy, by the side of the one who loves you with everything they have. You are never alone, dear one. Your angels are always here, walking with you, guiding you, sending you light and love every single day. May heaven's blessing always be upon you, bringing peace, courage, and clarity for every step ahead. You are seen, you are loved, you are protected, and you are worthy of every beautiful thing that is coming your way. With infinite love. Amen.